All right, hello everybody. This is a little lesson demonstrating one of the two kinds of problems that we can do involving imaginary numbers. We've been talking about imaginary numbers a little bit in class, and there's basically two different problem types I can give you. And in this video, I'm going to outline the first type. And problem type number one involves taking a square root, taking a radical that is going to come out imaginary, and writing it using I notation. And these basically three things that we're going to need in order to do this kind of problem. First thing we need is the fact that I is the square root of -1. We talked a little bit about square roots of negatives in class, and the idea is if I'm going to square a value and get -1, there's nothing that I can do that will give me that. I can multiply +1 times +1, and I get +1. If I multiply -1 times -1, once again we get +1, and I can't get that -1. But we still need to be able to deal with this kind of value, so in order to do that, we say it's an imaginary number, and we basically call it I. So we use these two interchangeably. If I see square root of -1, I can always replace it with I, and if I see I can always replace it with square root of -1. Those two things are, for all intents and purposes, the same. Likewise, I squared is equal to -1. And this basically comes from the fact that I is the square root of -1. If I square I get I squared. And if I square the square root of -1, I get -1. If I square a value that's in the square root, the square and the square root sort of cancel. They're opposites of each other. And I end up with -1. So I need to remember that these two things are the same, and likewise I can replace one for the other. And the only other thing we need here is our good old friend, the brain. We need our brains. We need our brains to be on and functioning. Hopefully you got your brain with you for these problems that we're going to take a look at. So we'll focus on the first problem type, and then in the second video that I'll put up, we'll do the other problem type. So problem type number one involves removing the radical sign and writing using I notation. So we have the square root of -100. Now, if this was just the square root of 100, it'd be easy. We'd be done. Square root of 100, we know is 10. Problem over, we move on. Unfortunately, we got that pesky little negative in front, right? And the fact that I've got -100 and I'm trying to square root that, that's what's going to cause problems here. Because I know 10 times 10 is 100. -10 times -10 is, once again, +100. I can't get that negative in there. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our process of simplifying square roots, and we're going to split this square root into a product of two square roots, both of which we can deal with. Again, the negative is the problem. So I'm going to make this the square root of 100 times the square root of -1. And I know if I multiply these two things together, I'll get the square root of -100, right? Because 100 times -1 is -100, and two square roots I can combine into one square root. So these two were good. Now the reason we split this up this way is the square root of 100, which is right here, this value, this we can do. Square root of 100 is 10. So I can write that down. And the square root of -1, well, we just talked about that. That's that value we can't really deal with. That's our imaginary number. We call that I. So I make that replacement. So now I have 10 times I, and that's my answer, 10i. We've now accomplished the task of removing the square root, and we've written it using I notation. 10i is the square root of -100. Sound good? I'm going to assume from your silence that that did sound good, because I can't hear you. I recorded this a while ago. So we'll move on to the second problem. In the next problem, the negative I have is out in front, right? I've got negative square root of 11i squared. Now for this one, the negative in front is going to stay in front. The negative outside the square root doesn't really impact what we're doing inside, so I don't need to worry about that. And what I have inside is 11i, and I'm squaring it, and then square rooting it. Now squaring a value and square rooting it, those are opposites. It's just like if I add 2, subtracting 2 will get me right back to where I started. If I multiply by 4, dividing by 4 will get me right back to where I started. So if I have 11i, and I square it, if I square root that, all I end up with is 11i. So this problem is going to be a negative in front. That negative in front stays in front. And the square root and the square basically cancel each other out, and I end up with 11i. Okay? And the basic idea, I'll go through sort of a simpler example here. If I have the square root of 4 squared, if I were to do this out longhand, this would be the square root of 4 squared, which is 16. If I square root 16, I get 4. So all that ends up happening is the square root and the square root basically cancel each other out. And I get what's inside. That's what happened here. I had 11i, I squared it, then square rooted it, which means I end up with just 11i. The negative front stays in front. Okay? Good with that problem? All right, we'll move on. So down here, square root of 36i squared. Well, let's see. I could replace I squared with negative 1 right now. That would be a possibility. And I would get the same thing. Let's try it that way. So I'm going to replace I squared with negative 1. So I now have the square root of 36 times negative 1. And I can multiply those two things together, certainly. But realistically, I'm just going to split these up in a minute anyway. So right now, since I have a product here, I have 36 times negative 1. I'm going to split that up right now into two separate square roots. So I have the square root of 36 times the square root of negative 1. Okay, that's exactly what I had a second ago. I just broke it up into two separate square roots. Now again, the reason we did this is because we can do both of these. The square root of 36 is 6. Easy enough. The square root of negative 1. Oh, that sounds familiar. Square root of negative 1. If only I knew what that was. Square root of negative 1. Oh yeah, that's our friend I. I forgot about that. So this is going to become I. So this comes down as I. And that's my answer. I have 6 times I. Well, that's 6i. Problem done. Now, I could also have done that from the very beginning. Rather than replacing I squared with negative 1, this is a product already. It's 36 times I squared. So another way I could have done that would be to take these two and split them up right now. The square root of 36 times the square root of I squared. Since this was a product before, all we did is split it up into each of their own square roots. And the square root of 36 would be 6 again, right? And if I have I, and I square it, then square root it, just like our friend 4 over here, all that's going to become is I. So I end up once again with 6i. So slightly different way to do the same problem, both of which we end up with our value 6i. Okay? Now the last one down here, this one's very similar to the 11i one we have above. I have inside the square root negative 6i, it's being squared and square rooted. Those two again are going to undo each other. If I have negative 6i, I square it and square root it, all I end up with is negative 6i. And this negative in front stays in front. So this is going to be negative in front, that just came right over. And then this value inside the square root here, this is going to be negative 6i. And I can multiply those two together. Negative, negative 6i, negative times a negative is positive, so this is going to be positive 6i. And that ends up being my answer, which is the same as what I got for the last problem. So again, the negative in front stayed in front. Negative 6i was squared and square rooted, which meant all that came out is negative 6i. And then I can combine these two negatives to make it positive. And that's our answer for that page. Hopefully that made a little bit of sense. Hopefully you could follow some of those processes. And that's what we do for this problem type. Removing the radical sign and write using I notation. Okay? The next video set we'll talk about the other direction, which is where I'm basically going from answers like this, taking a 6i, or a negative 11i, or a 10i, and going backwards and figuring out what they were as square roots. So that's going to be in the next video.